Ed and I, the security guy here, with another security brief. So the last couple of episodes, we focused on how biblical values should guide our understanding of biblical principles about risk. But what are those principles? What does Scripture teach us about risk? Well, it turns out quite a lot. Biblical narratives about risk are found throughout Scripture. For those interested, we've put just some examples of these narratives in this episode's show notes. Today, we'll talk about just a few of the principles that we can glean from those narratives. The first principle is that risk is stewardship. Risk requires us to make decisions about what God has asked us to steward. Author Anna Hampton points out that sometimes God can ask us to take calculated risks, as seen in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. So note that the stewards who took calculated risks were commended, while the one who took no risks at all was not. Sometimes, however, our stewardship requires us not preserving resources, but pouring them all out, as did the woman with the alabaster vase of expensive perfume in Matthew 26. Hampton writes, "Sometimes it seems when we risk for the Lord and lose everything, including precious lives, the Lord receives the risk as a fragrant offering that is honoring to Him." Another principle is that we must make courageous decisions in the face of risk. Now, courage is not the absence of fear. When God told Joshua to be strong and courageous, He did not say fear would not be present. To fear is to be human, but believers can face fear with courage and trust God to guide their decisions. Courage may require facing a seemingly overwhelming enemy, as Joshua did. Sometimes we may need the courage to retreat, as Paul did in Acts 9:25. Finally, we see that Scripture shows us that avoiding or mitigating risk is not unspiritual. Even though God leads some of His followers into high-risk situations, that does not mean He intends them to take every risk they encounter. There were times when Jesus hid Himself and times when He boldly stepped into risk. In an earlier episode, we already talked about Nehemiah. It should be noted that in Luke 14, Jesus taught about the cost of following Him, but then followed it up with two parables about strategic planning. Clearly, Christ asks us to lay everything down for Him, to follow Him and trust Him in all things, but He did not mean that we should never mitigate risk. So, to sum up, there are many examples of risk narratives in Scripture which teach us biblical principles of risk. 3 of those are the understanding that risk is stewardship, that we must make courageous decisions in the face of risk, and that mitigating risk is not unspiritual. Now you know. We'll talk more about biblical principles of risk in the next security brief. See you then.